Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be welcoming you all to BSI's annual Net Zero Week and to kick off this exciting programme of events. As the national standards body representing the interests of UK industry on the global stage, BSI is at the forefront of helping accelerate change in the way we tackle our economic, social, and environmental challenges. Preventing the devastating impacts of climate change and achieving the target of reaching net zero by 2050 is the greatest challenge of our time. Our international team of experts work in every sector, sharing best practice, shaping standards, finding new ways to measure organisational progress towards net zero to ultimately help us all get to the heart of the issues surrounding our sustainability challenges. It is our mission to actively support you to achieve your sustainability goals, whether you're at the beginning of your sustainability journey or at a point where our support can help you progress to the next steps. Net Zero Week provides a unique platform to showcase the scope of the work being done across key sectors to meet global carbon emission targets. The series of engaging webinars taking place throughout the week will cover a range of key topics from sustainable finance to net zero in the food supply chain. And through these interactive sessions, we really aim to provide you with the expert knowledge and the latest industry updates to help you reduce carbon emissions and to help encourage you to join us in working towards the UK's ambitious net zero targets. To mark the start of this week, we're also very proud to share our Net Zero Barometer report for 2022. And it provides critical insights into how UK businesses are managing the transition to net zero. Now, based on the results from the survey of 1,000 UK senior decision makers and sustainability professionals, the report highlights that whilst almost half of the respondents are focused on business growth, only 20% are prioritising reducing carbon emissions. Given that time is of the essence, this highlights the extent of the challenge that we're facing. Now, that said, it's not all doom and gloom, and our annual survey also revealed a desire and an optimism actually from participants that the UK would achieve its net zero goal. And nearly 3/4 of those surveyed had already set targets to meet net zero. Post COP26, 78% of respondents were more convinced that reaching net zero targets is possible. For further insights into how industry leaders are paving the way for a sustainable future, the BSI Net Zero Barometer Report 2022 is available to access from the link in the Teams chat. Finally, I want to express my thanks to the organisers who've been working tirelessly to ensure the success of this year's Net Zero Week. Thank you to our inspiring speakers for giving up their time to share their insights with us. And thank you to all of you who have registered to participate in these sessions. It really is only through collaborative action that we can pave the way to a sustainable future. Thank you.
I'd like to tell you about a partnership we agreed last year with BAZE, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. It came about because we had a new energy management standard due to launch, aimed at small and medium-sized organisations to help them reduce energy consumption and therefore reduce carbon emissions. Now, there's a lot that any organisation can do to support their journey to net zero, but reducing energy usage is a key part of it. I asked BAZE if they'd like to partner with us on the launch of this new standard, knowing the standard would match their aims to support SMEs on their journey to reaching net zero. They were really enthusiastic, so I asked them if they'd like to sponsor some copies so that they could be offered for free download. They agreed they'd sponsor 100,000 copies of the standard. We created a special version of the standard and a guide to using it, and both are available for free download from our website. So if you'd like a copy of our phased approach to energy management standard and a free guide, please visit the website. The link is in the chat, but you can just Google BSI 50005 Energy Management. We have a webinar coming soon, so keep an eye out for that and come along and ask our experts any questions you'd like an answer to. Please do share the link with your members, colleagues and friends so they can see how their organisations can benefit from the standard.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome and thank you very much indeed for joining our Net Zero Week webinar series in 2022. This afternoon, it's about the role of data and cyber-physical systems in achieving net zero. My name is David Cookow. I'm the Associate Director Digital here at the UK's national standards body, BSI, and I and my team are responsible for standards and best practice for our digital sector, both nationally and internationally. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. So delegates yourselves will remain muted during the webinar. We will be showing slides. This is a live webinar, but we won't be on camera until the end of the session, where we will have a Q&A. So I will hopefully try and bring all of our delegates and speakers, all of our speakers online so we can see them, and then we can start to run the Q&A. The webinar will be recorded for those who can't attend, so you will be able to download it and listen to it again if you need. These are very much interactive sessions, so we would encourage you to ask as many questions as possible throughout the webinar by using the Q&A function box. Please don't use the chat. If you want to ask the questions, put them into the Q&A, and hopefully we'll have time to go through as many of those as we can. I'll apologise in advance if we don't get through them all, but we'll try to get through as many during the Q&A session. If there are any handouts, they'll be on the right-hand side of the screen, so you'll be able to download those. And as I said, we will have time at the end for questions, so please submit them as we go through. So this afternoon, we'll explore the vital role that accurate, trustworthy, and shared data plays in informing sustainability-related decisions, and specifically how connected digital technologies with physical infrastructure, sometimes called cyber-physical systems or cyber-physical infrastructure, can translate into reducing CO2 emissions. We have a fantastic set of speakers and panelists. I'll just very quickly introduce them before we kick off with our initial slides and thoughts. So we have Josh Harris-Kirkwood joining us from DCMS, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. Josh is Head of Data Economy Innovation, and Josh's team is responsible for delivering Mission 1 of the National Data Strategy, which is all about unlocking the value of data in the UK economy. We also have Dr. June Brawner joining us. She is Policy Advisor at the Royal Society, and June leads on the Society's work on data-driven, digitally enabled net zero transition and privacy enhancing technologies, often known as PETs. And finally, we have Sarah Hayes. She's the Credo strategist and enabling lead. This is the Climate Resilience Demonstrator project that you may be aware of at the Connected Places Catapult. And Sarah is an economist, and Sarah, as you may know, was the original author of the document produced by the National Infrastructure Commission on the value of data for the UK economy. So I will hand over to Josh, and hopefully he can then start his presentation. Josh, over to you.
Hi there, good afternoon everyone, and thank you David for that very kind introduction. My name is Josh Harris-Kirkwood, and I am, as David said, head of the Data Economy Innovation team at DCMS. It's really fantastic to be here today, and thank you so much to David and everyone at BSI for having me and for organising this session on such an important issue. As David said, my team is focused on delivering Mission 1 of the National Data Strategy, which is all about unlocking the value of data across the economy. And we believe that innovative use of data, including through cyber-physical systems, could play a key role in speeding up the journey to achieving net zero. Before I get into that detail, I wanted to give a bit of a sense of the size of the prize and the potential opportunities if we get this right. So if we go on to the next slide. Imagine if your home's energy performance certificate was not carried out and evaluated manually by a surveyor, but rather took real-time data from across your home to understand its energy efficiency, which then in turn recommended immediate steps that you could take to improve your home's energy efficiency and reduce your energy consumption. That sort of innovation not only reduces bills, but your carbon footprint as well. Or imagine you're out shopping and you see a jumper that you like. Right there, you could scan a QR code and that would tell you the whole carbon footprint of the jumper from manufacture all the way to ending up in the store. These are potentially simple solutions that could incentivize manufacturers to be greener. Or a third example, the deployment of climate smart devices, which could revolutionize food production across the world. For instance, one project funded by the World Bank in China, which deployed climate smart agriculture to improve soil conditions, boosted production of rice by 12% and maize by 9%. These opportunities are all dependent on harnessing the power of data. The government's plan to unlock the power of data and seize these opportunities is captured in our national data strategy. So in the following slides, I'll briefly outline the strategy and at the same time explain how this work can support our journey to decarbonisation. The challenge here is huge, but so is the opportunity. So if we go on to the next slide. In autumn 2020, the UK published an ambitious new national data strategy. That strategy is a framework for action that the UK will take to build an innovative, pro-growth, data-driven economy underpinned by public trust in a way that works for everyone across society. I'm not going to go through all 80 pages of what the National Data Strategy says, and I'm sure you've all read it anyway. But this first slide provides an overview of the whole strategy and how the missions, opportunities, and pillars interlink. The missions are how we've been structuring our work, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. So if we go into the next slide. Mission 1 is about unlocking the value of data held across the economy. This is the mission that I lead on. It's very close to my heart. And this is about policy that treats data as an economic and social asset. It's about driving productivity and about innovation. And it's about making sure those organizations that could drive the most value out of data can access it in the first place. We're looking at the competition regime. We're looking at where government might invest to support the right data sharing architecture to enable greater data sharing access and collaboration. And we're looking at where government should stay out of the way and let the market deliver. I'll get on to a bit more detail on Mission 1 in a moment. But first, I'll give a bit of a sense of each of the other missions. So Mission 2 is about securing a pro-growth regime. The UK's approach to data will be pro-growth and innovation friendly, focusing on underpinning the trustworthy use of personal data to maintain high standards of data protection. You will have seen that government published a consultation back in autumn called Data: A New Direction, which sets out our plans for the reform of the data protection regime. My colleagues in that team have been reviewing responses to that consultation, and the government response will be published in due course. Our proposal set out in the consultation would offer clear rules so that researchers and innovators can use data responsibly to improve their products and services. It's vital that our climate scientists, along with innovators, have a data regime that encourages data innovation and can support a greener future. UK startups working on climate tech raised over £1 billion from investors last year, and we're keen to ensure that our data regulatory regime can continue to support innovators and help us build back better. And whether these climate tech firms are looking to produce alternatives to single-use plastics or looking to develop digital twins of homes in the UK, we're hoping our proposed reforms will make it easier for scientists and innovators to collaborate and share data in a responsible way to accelerate our net zero transition. Mission 3 is all about transforming government's use of data to drive efficiency and improve public services. Now, all governments could get more out of the data assets they hold. Citizens expect it. And contrary to a lot of what is said about privacy concerns, our analysis shows that most citizens expect the government to make better use of the data that citizens already provide to deliver better and more efficient services. The better use and join up of government data will also help us better track our net zero target in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. We want to lead by example and make government data openly accessible wherever possible. As an example, the open release of transport data enables the development of apps such as City Mapper, allowing real-time access to information for individuals to navigate cities in the most efficient way, which encourages the use of public transport rather than private vehicles. If we go on to the next slide, I'll talk about the final two missions. So mission 4 is about ensuring the security and resilience of the infrastructure on which data relies. The increasing importance of data in the workings of our economy and society means we're increasingly dependent on it, and in particular on the infrastructure that underpins its use. COVID has demonstrated this. Data infrastructure has been critical for everything from remote working to the operation of assets within our critical national infrastructure to on-demand video streaming. And data centres play a critical role in delivering and maintaining the crucial data infrastructure of the UK. But at the same time, we know that data infrastructure, and especially data centres, can be very energy intensive. And the National Data Strategy acknowledges the full impact of data and digital on sustainability is not yet fully understood. We are, however, seeing the sector take a proactive approach through initiatives such as the Climate Neutral Data Centre Pact. We're also seeing technological progress delivering efficiencies in data centres too. For example, DeepMind has delivered savings of up to 40% in the electricity demand for cooling by using technological and data-driven solutions. We commend the work that the sector is already doing here, but we will continue to work with the sector to understand what more can be done to accelerate their journey towards net zero. And finally, mission 5, championing the international flow of data. Outside the UK, creating the right framework of global data infrastructure, standards and rules will be key to shaping an accessible, interoperable international data ecosystem that works as a whole for the UK. And now that the UK has left the EU, we are capitalising on the UK's newfound sovereignty to promote the benefits of cross-border data flows as a driving force for growth, innovation and cooperation, helping to unlock the power of data, ensuring a return on the benefits of global data and digital transformation to the UK economy and people and society. The trusted exchange of information across borders underpins global business operations, enables trade, and supports international cooperation. And the free flow of data across borders is essential in taking coordinated action to monitor and combat climate change at a global scale, whether that is the exchange of weather data that can then make solar renewable energy more predictable, or allowing us to attend conferences virtually rather than flying around the world. We go on to the slide 6, which is our final slide. So I'm just going to focus a little bit more on mission 1. So in late 2021, we published the mission 1 policy framework, which sets out our plan to set the correct conditions to make private and third sector data more usable, accessible and available. Putting in place the right conditions that encourage the better sharing of data could have a revolutionary impact on our net zero ambitions. Timely, accurate data is absolutely essential for understanding the effectiveness and impact of carbon reducing initiatives and prioritising the interventions that can have the greatest impact. As an example, the Office for Zero Emissions Vehicles has consulted on proposals to improve the consumer experience of public charging points, which included a proposal to legislate on opening up charge point data. That sort of innovation could help drive down the costs of owning an electric vehicle by encouraging competition, innovation and efficiencies, reducing range anxiety for electric vehicle users, and encouraging the mass market uptake of electric vehicles. So by way of conclusion, you can see that data and cyber physical infrastructure will play a key role in delivering net zero, and respondents to our National Data Strategy consultation agreed. The better use of data is not just a key enabler in our work to meet net zero, but also in our work to support other key government priorities, such as supporting regional growth and levelling up. In future, we've made sure that net zero will be a key theme of our National Data Strategy Forum. This workstream will aim to showcase the positive role that data can play in supporting our net zero ambitions, whilst continually challenging what more we could be doing to support that transition. We have also been working with the Royal Society on identifying existing initiatives and barriers to achieving net zero. In January, the National Data Strategy Forum hosted a workshop in collaboration with the Royal Society to showcase best practice initiatives where data is being used to support net zero and to help identify the barriers that are preventing different sectors from making the most of data in their own plans for reducing energy use and emissions. The National Digital Twin Programme's Climate Resilience Demonstrator has been a great demonstration of the role that connected digital twins can play in responding to climate change-related flooding. So I'm delighted that June and Sarah are both on the panel to share their insights. I'm looking forward to our discussion shortly and listening to all of your great questions. We have a really exciting agenda here and do not take our responsibilities lightly. However, we know that we cannot achieve our ambitions without support and would encourage everyone to consider how your organisation can make the most of the data opportunity to support net zero. Thanks.
Josh, thank you so much indeed. Super slides and super informative, and we'll certainly be coming back to the National Data Strategy and its role when we get to the Q&A session at the end, which is a very super segue into June, who is on next. June, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David, and many thanks to the BSI for hosting this panel and organizing this session today. I think, as Josh said, this is something that I think is really critical, and we're at a really important moment in history, I think, to make the most of what resources we have available. And so, yeah, really pleased to be part of this panel. So if we go to the first slide, I'll just briefly give some background on who we are and what we do at the Royal Society. So the Royal Society is the UK's National Academy of Sciences. We work to promote the use of science for the benefit of humanity, which is no small remit. And as part of operationalizing that overarching mission, we have a policy section, and within the policy section, we have a team devoted to data and digital policy. And I work within that team as a policy advisor, looking specifically at data for the planet and for tackling climate change, reaching net zero, as well as privacy enhancing technologies. So we have a portfolio of reports outlining things like the careful stewardship of machine learning technologies, how to strengthen the UK's data science talent base, and data governance to promote human flourishing. So as Josh mentioned, we also recently have worked with his colleagues at DCMS, specifically on data and digital tech for net zero, working with the National Data Strategy Forum in an event back in January, which also featured Sarah Hayes, who we'll hear from after this talk. So I'm really delighted that we can join forces again today and continue some of those conversations that began in January. So moving to the next slide, I want to outline kind of why we're looking at data for net zero. So back in November of 2019, which feels like a world away at this point, we started to look at how digital tech could help us to tackle climate change. Specifically, we set out to investigate how digital tech could be mobilized to tackle climate change through greener systems of computing, as well as the application of tech to reduce carbon emissions in other areas. We wanted to explore pathways for development of trustworthy digital systems to support efforts to reduce carbon emissions and create a vision for the future of digital technologies, how they could be deployed in the support of reducing carbon emissions. And specifically, how could we craft and influence some good policy decisions that could really make this happen? So going to the next slide, we outline in our report, which came out in December of 2020, some core digital capabilities that we saw as really supporting a digital net zero transition. And a lot of this hinges on simulation. So things like digital twins, which we'll hear more about later in my talk and in the next one. And then in addition to this, we can use things like simulation digital twins to do things like optimization, to promote the better analysis and mapping of data, the better use of data in connecting sensors at new scales in order to track and verify the movement of goods and people in a way that's never really been possible before, which is quite exciting. I think we saw during COVID, for example, that digital tech enabled new ways of working. So even in joining this virtual webinar, we're all, saving a bit of our carbon footprint by commuting virtually. But it's also enabling new things like precision farming. One study that we found, which considered artificial intelligence alone, found that AI could reduce 4% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and that would contribute up to 5.2 trillion USD to the global economy and 38.2 million new jobs. Existing studies that we use to synthesize in our report as well demonstrated that digital technology, which is already in the field and up and running, could help reduce UK and global carbon emissions by up to 15%, contributing nearly a third of the 50% reduction required by 2030 to keep us on track to mitigate a 2-degree centigrade rise in temperatures. So on the next slide, we highlight 4 areas of action, which we brought out in our reporting. And we did this through convening a broad range of stakeholders and evidence gathering events and workshops where these 4 areas really emerged. And those include building a trusted data infrastructure, optimizing a digital carbon footprint, establishing a data-enabled net zero economy, and setting new research and innovation challenges, which will help to digitalize the net zero transition. And to do this, we did a lot of evidence synthesis. We spoke to lots of experts. We drew from the expertise of our fellowship at the Society, and we commissioned some new research specifically into the carbon footprint of the ICT sector. So on the next slide, we highlight some of the original research that we've done. Basically, suffice it to say that very few studies actually give us a good idea of what the carbon sector of the ICT sector is. And I think when we talk about the use of data, it's worth noting that the greater use of data does entail new infrastructure, and that has to be done in a proportionate way and in a way that helps to mitigate our carbon footprint rather than exacerbating the condition. And then on the next slide, just quickly to flag, and this is something that you can look into in our report in more detail, is that if you look at projections of carbon emissions from the tech and telecommunications industry to 2030, the dotted lines represent kind of where we need to be, and the solid lines represent through various calculations, different projections of where we expect the ICT sector to be in 2030. And as you can see, those lines are quite different. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done in making sure that our systems are fit for purpose as we embark on the use of more and greater shares of data. So on the next slide, I also want to highlight a few recommendations that we've made around trusted data infrastructure. So we think it's really important that international arrangements support a flow of data around the planet, because climate change does not respect borders, and we don't think that data should either, in the sense that we need to be partnering across borders to tackle this problem. We also advocate for a task force for the digitalization of the net zero transition, and we see government really taking the lead on this, as well as through their procurement processes and in sponsoring Pathfinder studies. We also think that data that can help to achieve net zero should be made more accessible through appropriate arrangements, and we can come back to that a little bit later. And then on the next slide, we have some further recommendations that we've made around a trusted data infrastructure. For example, we think there should be some real social components considered in all of this. People should be able to inspect and challenge their outputs and their consumption as it's being monitored. We need systems to be secure and resilient to the inevitable crises that will come with climate change. And we need systems to benefit communities. And that can be done through things like co-designing with the communities in which digital systems are deployed. And this will help us to mitigate social impact of those technologies. And on the next slide, we've just made some recommendations as well for the computing sector, where we think the tech sector could really help to lead by example, specifically in reporting their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We think grid integration will be especially important, as well as energy proportionality, which means that computing should be energy proportionate. We see the rise of things like, say, cryptocurrencies, which use blockchain technology, as not necessarily being all bad, but there are certain protocols that coins like Bitcoin use, which do have a really harmful effect on the environment. And so we need to think really critically about how we're using technologies going forward. And on the next slide. So going into the next section, I just want to share a few examples and challenges that we've highlighted. So it's already been mentioned that things like the internet and video conferencing during the pandemic are really shifting the way that we work. And in fact, we saw that emissions decreased by 17% in April of 2020. Naturally, that's gone back up, but I think that's a clear indicator of a real potential to shift our working patterns and other things that we might have taken for granted before 2020. As Josh has already mentioned, the opening of transport data has allowed for devices and new applications like City Mapper to access traffic information in real time so people can choose less congested routes to take. Transport is the biggest emitting sector in the UK, accounting for 24% of emissions in 2019. But at the same time, it's already highly digitalized. So there's a lot of potential there to use machine learning, for example, to understand how vehicles are moving in city centers and improve congestion prediction. Smart parking is another related example, which has been piloted in Milton Keynes, where we're using sensors in parking spaces, which can communicate information to road users through apps as they look for parking. That means you're not endlessly circling and making loops around blocks trying to find a parking space, which eases traffic and inevitably stress as well. We also see that modeling is allowing for more accurate weather forecasting, so farmers can plant according to those predictions, protecting crops and fields and preventing waste in that way. Wind and solar renewable energy generation are more feasible, and we have more preparedness to weather disruption by using AI to predict those events. It also means that supermarkets can stock more appropriate foods if there are going to be floods or blizzards. And then, of course, through digital twins, factories can optimize and pursue predictive maintenance. We can use virtual reality and augmented reality to enable architects to digitally experience a space and modify plans before housing is constructed, rather than having to tear down and rebuild after mistakes have been made. So I want to zoom in on a couple of those examples in the last few minutes. So on the next slide, I want to just quickly look at digital twins, and this is in anticipation of hearing much more about this from Sarah in a minute. So I just want to explain how we've discussed them in our report, and that's in that they play a crucial role in control loops. So digital twins entail a virtual representation of a physical asset, which can be used to understand, predict, and optimize the performance of that asset. So simply speaking, you have sensors in the real world which collect data. They feed that into data-driven systems, and then someone can be running a simulation on that data, and real-time data is fed back through those sensors so that you can make course corrections and test things in that kind of simulated space rather than in the real world. And that's huge for things like even testing policy interventions and trying to model for behaviors before you make those types of decisions. So on the next slide, this is a kind of thought experiment of sorts. If you could imagine a future where every asset is online and connected through digital infrastructure, we could use digital twins to help establish control loops of a sort. And these control loops could then enable the monitoring, reduction, and optimization of greenhouse gas emissions across sectors. So you can see here in the image, we're looking at power supplies as well as buildings, the transport sector, even agriculture, and there are social systems part of this as well. So economics in real time, people's patterns of movement. So we're tying all of these things together to have a more holistic idea of what's happening so that we can intervene appropriately. So on the next slide, we highlight some tensions that inevitably come out of the use of data. These include things like respecting people's privacy, encouraging data sharing for private and public benefit, ensuring that data is traded and transferred in ways that are mutually beneficial, and ensuring that acceptable levels of risk for individuals and communities are established in promoting and distributing the benefits of data fairly across society. On the next slide, I want to share just one way that we're starting to look at addressing those tensions, and this previews some of our upcoming work on privacy enhancing technologies. One of the use cases that we're looking at with privacy enhancing tech, or PETs, is how we can use the Internet of Things and digital twins and this concept of a control loop to enable something like a digital twin of the UK's energy system. Energy supply is one of the largest sources of emissions. About a fifth of total emissions in the UK between 2010 and 2020 were made from energy supply and production. And fossil fuels made up 75% of the UK's electricity in 2010. Naturally, that's declining with the disappearance of coal. But with 50% of nuclear set to retire by 2020, renewables really need to increase rapidly. And right now we rely on things like sun and wind energy to feed into networks intermittently to meet those needs, but that entails production risks because we can't really predict exactly when the wind will blow or even indeed when the sun will shine here in the UK. So meanwhile, 40% of the UK's total emissions come from households, and heating is the biggest contributor. And smart meters can really help us to address some of those energy needs and help us to understand how people are using energy. At the same time, smart meter data is protected under UK GDPR as personal data. So we're looking at examples in the Netherlands where they've been able to use cohorts of smart meters and different privacy enhancing technologies like zero knowledge proofs or federated learning models in order to understand how people are using energy without necessarily sharing that data or having high resolution understandings of household levels, but still useful enough for us to monitor and make decisions on the grid accordingly. So I just want to close by saying that we really think that data sharing and digitalization will be critical, whether in something like a digital twin of the UK's energy system or in any of these other examples. And there are countless, and I've only shared just a few now. So I think it's really important that going forward, while we've been looking at digital tech and data for the planet in this report that I've just shared, it's also the context and the backdrop against which all of our other work at the Society is happening. The climate crisis is inevitably, part of what we're doing going forward in things like privacy enhancing tech and in some new work that we're doing on disruptive tech for research and innovation. So we really hope that these new technologies will disrupt fields like climate research and help to improve our capacity to adapt, mitigate, and to course correct. So I think that's a good place for me to stop and let Sarah pick up on the topic of what digital twins can offer to us in meeting the climate challenge. And thank you very much for your time, and I really look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you, June. Thank you very much indeed. Very, very informative, and a super segue into to welcoming Sarah, who I'm sure will enlighten us more about digital twins. It's also very interesting that we can never avoid talking about the weather here in the UK. Sarah, over to you, and welcome.
Thank you, David. And it's really great to be on this panel alongside June and Josh. I am looking forward to the discussion a bit later on. But first of all, I'm going to tell you a bit more about Credo, the Climate Resilience Demonstrator Project. And before I get into it, it's worth making the point that Credo is the pilot project, or has been the pilot project, for the National Digital Twin Programme, which was run out of the Centre for Digital Built Britain. And as CDBB completes its mission, or completed its mission at the end of March, and we concluded the first phase of Credo at the end of March, Credo is now being taken forward by Connected Places Catapult, which is brilliant because it's a demonstrator project that continues to see further life, and that's exactly what we want to happen, is it for as a demonstrator project, for it to turn into reality at the end of the day. That's where we're heading. So on to the next slide, please. So we know that infrastructure is a major contributor to climate change, and we are beginning to have a better understanding that infrastructure isn't just a set of separate sectors, but it's a system of systems. And it really helps when we start to see how all the different sectors in infrastructure are connected together and start to look at the interdependencies between different sectors: energy, water, communication, transport, etc. The next slide, please. So the IPCC has published a number of reports recently, and the adaptation report, which was published earlier this year, talks about these interdependencies. So it notes that these interdependencies between infrastructure systems are creating climate risk because there are connections between infrastructure sectors and the assets are dependent on other assets. This in itself creates extra climate risk that we need to be concerned about, and we need to be doing something about it. We need to be understanding it better. And the next slide. The Committee on Climate Change has published some reports which also call out these infrastructure interdependencies. So the recent Adaptation Progress Report talks about these infrastructure interdependencies, and it says there is a continuing lack of data on the vulnerability of infrastructure to extreme weather and the steps being taken to manage interdependencies between sectors. So the Committee on Climate Change are really calling out, and they have been for some time now, this low level of understanding of infrastructure interdependencies, and really it's a call to action that we need to do something about it. So in the next slide, I'm going to invite you to Sanford City. I'm going to invite you to imagine you are in Sanford City, which is a fictional city. And I want to imagine that you've just experienced a really bad storm. So this is a 1 in 100 year storm, so Storm Ruby, it's been named, and it has caused really bad flooding across this city. And as a result of that flooding, it's caused all the infrastructure services to be out of service. So we've got a power cut, we've lost running water, and we've lost communications. So we're in a really bad state in this city because we hadn't anticipated how the infrastructure system was going to be impacted by this kind of storm, which has been caused by climate change. So the question that we are faced with is, how could we better protect this kind of city in advance of this kind of storm? So on the next slide, you can see that if you only have information about the water network in front of you, it's very difficult to make a plan. How can you look to protect the whole of the city when you don't know what's happening with the energy network assets or the communication assets? You don't know how they're going to react or behave to this kind of flood in the future. So it's very difficult to make this kind of plan. So on the next slide, you can see that what we really need is a credo type digital twin, so a climate change adaptation digital twin. And I'm very grateful to June earlier for giving a definition of what a digital twin is, and I hope that by talking through this example here, that will start to bring to life what we can mean by the term digital twin. So what we're doing in the Credo project, or what we've done so far in phase 1, is that we've brought together data across energy, water and telecoms networks. We've been working with Anglian Water, BT and UK Power Networks, who've brought their people and their data to the project. And what we've been able to do is to get their asset data and to pull it together using a knowledge graph or a database type approach, to pull it together into a digital twin, so that we then have what you can see on the right. We can just simply pull together information about assets into one place, and that starts to show us what the infrastructure system looks like. Now, I will point out that what you see here on the right is synthetic data. It's not real data, because when you go and you ask infrastructure asset owners for their asset data, they're going to be very reluctant to give it to you. It's not something that is particularly easily shareable. It's held confidentially. So what we've done in the project is we've used a data license so that the data can be brought together and held securely on the Daphne platform. So that's the data analytics facility for national infrastructure. And there's been a whole lot of requirements that have been put in place to ensure that we can protect the data. And from that real data, we've been able to generate synthetic data, which sets out, or it matches and mirrors the kind of relationships that you would see in the real data. And then we can use it for public purposes. And in fact, it's been really useful to generate the synthetic data. So simply pulling that data together, first of all, it can help you spot mistakes in the data. So if you see that there's a wastewater pumping station in the wrong place and there's no power connected, you can go back to the original data and see where any mistakes are and start to sort out those mistakes. It also helps you to eyeball these infrastructure interdependencies. So here you can see where the main electricity, the power substations are, and the main communication exchanges are. And you can see that there are a whole number of other assets that are dependent on those key assets. So if those key assets, which are highlighted in yellow, fail, then you can see a whole lot of other assets will fail because of those connections. So simply just bringing the data together gives us insights. So it's also helpful to note that in parallel to just bringing the data together, what happened during the course of this project so far is that Anglian Water went back and looked at their data, and they were very honest, and they said, okay, we can do some further work to clean up the data sets at source to improve data quality. So it's this idea that if you want to share data, it's going to be it'll be more shareable if it's of a higher quality. So it's this idea that you clean your data once, so you put a lot of effort into managing your information and making sure it's of a high quality so that you can reuse it many times and across many different initiatives, both internally and externally. And this is all aligned with the information management framework approach, which is a principled approach to sharing data at scale. So it's all about cleaning data at source so that you can reuse it many times. So we have made a little bit of progress in the project with respect to the information management framework, but there's a whole lot more work to be done in that area across all organisations. So that's just the asset data. And on the next slide, what we have then done is brought in flood data. So this is flood data looking at future flooding scenarios, which uses UK climate projection data to understand what's the impact of climate change and what would future flood scenarios look like. Now, I am going to gloss over the amount of work that went into putting together this flood data, because this data isn't readily available at the moment. It's quite resource intensive to get this data together, because it's looking at future flood scenarios and looking at surface water flooding, and that requires high performance computing power, the capability to do that across the whole of the UK. To be able to scale this and really to get the data that we need across the whole of the UK, we really need to improve our computing capabilities to be able to do this, to be able to handle the amount of data that is needed to really understand the impact of climate change across the UK and across the whole globe. But what we've been able to do in the area of interest is to see, okay, this is what future flooding scenarios might look like. So what we then do within the model is we have what is called an asset failure model. And that asset failure model tells us if assets get wet, what is the probability of those assets failing? And then there is a system impact model, which says if there are failed assets in the system, what assets are connected to those and dependent on those failed assets and will therefore fail as a result. So how do you propagate the failure across the system? So the end result of these models is that you've got a set of assets which have failed because they're wet, but you've also got a number of assets which have failed not because they're wet, they're in dry areas, they aren't flooded, but because they are connected to and dependent on wet assets. So it really gives you that big picture of how does one flood cause a cascade of failure across the whole infrastructure system. So that then helps us think about these questions of what can we do to prepare in advance of this kind of storm happening, or how can we better respond in the future to emergency events like this. So really helping us to think about these big questions around system resilience and adaptation. So on the next slide, we've produced a visualization which is available on the Digital Twin Hub, and you can have a play around with this visualization to see how the data is brought together and how the assets are connected and what's the impact of the flood. And that really is, that's sort of giving you an idea of what the tool would look like at the end in terms of what the asset owners would see. And on the next slide, and we also developed an app to really give an idea of what we want Credo to do in the future. So far, we've just brought the data together to be able to show what the impact of flooding looks like. what we would want to do in the future is to develop it so we could explore the impact of different interventions. What can we do to protect cities in advance of storms happening in the future? So here we explore an intervention where we might say, okay, let's relocate the primary power substation to an area outside of the flood zone. And here the digital twin runs the simulation, and it tells you that as a result of this intervention, you can increase the level of resilience. So you can minimize the extent of power loss and the extent of telecoms disruption. Everyone's still got running water in this scenario. And so as a result of that intervention, you've got a fairly high level of resilience across the whole infrastructure system. And on the next slide, what this is really sort of showing us is that, you know, we can start to compare the trade-offs. So moving a, sorry, back to that slide, moving a power substation is obviously a very expensive thing to do, but it gives you a high level of resilience. But it is also likely to be a very high carbon impact intervention. So what we'd want the digital twin to analyse for us is, well, what's the cost in terms of pounds or dollars? What's the level of resilience that we achieve, and what's the carbon impact, so that we can look at the trade-off between the different factors. And this helps us to compare different options and to see how do we start thinking about resilience from a systems point of view, and perhaps from a carbon impact point of view if we're working towards net zero. And how might we, you know, rather than just an individual network point of view, so from the water network point of view or the energy network, how do we think about it across all networks and from that system point of view? And I think this sort of points to a coordination issue here, that, you know, a lot of things that like this need to be kick-started by government, because there is a coordination problem, because a lot of the benefit is social benefit rather than just private benefit. So onto that, next slide, please. So there are a number of recommendations that have emerged just during this first phase of Credo. So they're set out in the reports which are published on the Digital Twin Hub. Very quickly here, the recommendations, some of the key ones. So shared data, as I've mentioned, can highlight anomalies in the data, and it can offer immediate insights. On the technical side, ontologies help with scaling up, and knowledge graphs support ontologies. And some of that information is set out in the technical reports. But really importantly, purpose and collaborative intent are essential. So having a clear purpose for your digital twin, if you're, you know, what is it that you're trying to solve here with respect to net zero? What's it trying to do? What's the use case? And then getting people to collaborate around that use case and that purpose is really important. And on the last slide here, the next slide, we found, you know, we think that communication is really, really important here. So we made a film, Tomorrow Today. So it isn't just about using data to tackle net zero, but it's about using data to enable us to collaborate together to tackle climate change and to work towards net zero. So if you haven't had a chance to watch this film, it's only 6 minutes long and it's on the Digital Twin Hub. I would really recommend that you have a watch of it, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Sarah, thank you so much indeed. If I could just ask our speakers just to pop their cameras on, would be great. Fantastic. In fact, there you all are. Brilliant. Thank you, guys. Super presentations, very informative. I would encourage our delegates to go and register on the Digital Twin Hub that Sarah mentioned. A shout out for that. It's a super place to collaborate, share information, access more data, to answer some additional questions if you have them. So please go and access that. I think Sarah had the link on there. We may add that into the chat. So I would encourage those delegates to fire in their questions now, which would be really useful. They're already flooding in, which is great. What I'm going to do actually is bring us back to Josh to give June and certainly Sarah a chance to catch their breath. and bring us right back to where we started around the national data strategy. And I think just ask Josh perhaps to elaborate a little bit more, and I'll come back to the other panelists as well, around you know, what can the national data strategy do to encourage the sharing of data. And I think my question really sort of relates more to that kind of behavior change, which has been mentioned through the presentation. So how can we encourage the people to change their behaviors to share more data more effectively, and how do we think the national data strategy can help?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks very much, David, and thanks also to June and Sarah for such fascinating presentations. Really interesting. Yeah, so it's a really good question, David. There are kind of a few areas. So I mean, I guess the starting point is that, you know, we're coming up to a couple of years since the national data strategy was published, but actually at the time, you know, it was quite radical and quite new for the government to essentially be saying, we want to shift the default away from locking up data and hiding it away and protecting it as the default, and towards using it and sharing it where it's valuable and where it can have a positive impact. So that kind of messaging, I think, you know, from government is really important. But also what's kind of really important is what's being delivered under the strategy. And there's maybe a few areas or a couple of areas that I'll pick out. So one is something that I spoke about, and I won't go kind of into more detail again on it right now, but you know, obviously there's a number of proposals within the Data and New Direction consultation, various areas in which we've kind of proposed to make it better and easier to share data in the right circumstances. We're obviously considering responses to that at the moment, but you know, that could potentially be something that supports behavior change and drives people to share data a bit more. And then I might just kind of zoom in on a particular program of work, just because they've been mentioned kind of a couple of times by the other speakers. Particular area of work in my area, looking at privacy enhancing technologies, and we see these as having kind of real potential value, because what they start to do is kind of square the circle of, you know, that kind of starting point, that assumes trade-off between, you know, kind of risk and privacy, and therefore kind of needing to lock up data, versus kind of being able to drive the value from data. And what privacy enhancing technologies can do is help drive the value from data sets without opening up the necessarily kind of sensitive or confidential elements of those data sets. And the potential impact for net zero is really huge. And so a couple of areas that we're kind of particularly looking at there. So one is that at the Summit for Democracy, the US-led initiative that happened in December, we joined with the US, announced a prize challenge on privacy enhancing technologies, and the intent to collaborate on that with the US. So the kind of full launch of that is imminent, but that will be a kind of really interesting area to help kind of drive development and uptake of privacy enhancing technologies. And then the other area is a program of work that the ICO is conducting, looking at the role of anonymization and pseudonymization techniques and how those should be treated under legislation, which is again really important and can hopefully, you know, subject to the outcome of that work, drive some of these techniques more into the mainstream.
Josh, thank you very much. I'll go to June and Sarah, I think, and perhaps sort of get their thoughts, particularly around what else could we be doing. It's an opportunity to share your thoughts into Josh and his team. So June, what else do you think we could be doing, and your comments on the national data strategy and how it can help reduce CO2 emissions?
Sure, that's a great question. So I think I'll answer by way of sharing some insights from our discussion back in January. So not just my opinions, but I think you know, we heard from a wide range of stakeholders who agreed that there were kind of three key areas that the national data strategy could be looking at. And the first was around demonstration, so making sure that good data sharing examples are highlighted and shared where they do exist. and making sure that the government leads by example, maybe starting with a stock take of available data sets in various departments. Synthetic data was also highlighted as a good demonstrator, and I'm glad that Sarah mentioned this in the context of digital twins. We also think about this as a kind of privacy enhancing technology in that it enables innovation and proof of concept testing without compromising anyone's personal private data. So the use of new technologies like synthetic data could be really important. And then developing Pathfinder projects specifically with objectives in the climate domain. And then the second area that we saw potential action was under incentives. So making sure that the public really sees the benefit of using data in reaching net zero and how data can drive efficiencies and lower costs, which I think gets everyone's attention. At the same time, a general culture of open data should really be fostered. And I was glad to hear from Josh just now that we could be moving to more of a default for sharing data rather than locking it down in order to really maximize that value. And in fact, a long-term view of this problem, I think, really highlights the fact that there is a cost around not sharing data. And so maybe, taking that angle to demonstrate to the wider public what the benefit could be. So identifying new incentive structures and even new business models. So as we move to a less centralized energy system, you'll see a system wherein consumers are actually delivering value to the grid, and the Energy Digitalization Task Force really highlights this in their recent recommendations around electric vehicles and the need to consider those new business models and new dynamics at play in the market. At the same time, consumers have to feel protected before they are motivated to share data for net zero. And again, privacy enhancing technologies could play a real role here. And I think to that end, privacy enhancing technology is almost a misnomer. I think others in the space have called it partnership enhancing technology, and I think that's a great paradigm to be working with and going forward. And then lastly, the third area is around implementation. So there should really be some foundational work done before data sharing is really normalized, and that includes things like standards. So in energy data, for example, a sort of HTML is still required for interoperability. And again, the Energy Digitalization Task Force highlights that we need a digital spine to communicate across the energy system, and I think that transfers to other domains as well. More consistent standards in ESG around different sectors also need to be addressed, and then regulators will have to adapt to digitalized and data-enabled markets in new ways. So coming back to those new business models. So I think there's quite a range of actions were brought out in those discussions back in January, but I see them as kind of falling under those three categories of demonstrating, incentivizing, and implementing.
Jim, thank you so much. We'll come back to a couple of points you've mentioned there about standards. No doubt we'll cover that in a moment. Sorry, my phone is just ringing. And also you mentioned some good examples, and we'll come back to that, I think, around perhaps you can share some of those. Before we do that, perhaps Sarah, we'll just get your thoughts on the National Data Strategy and what else could we be doing?
Yeah, so I think there are lots of good examples of data sharing initiatives. The challenge when we're talking about net zero is scaling up. So how do you scale up data sharing? That is the challenge. And you really need a common approach to sharing data. You need a common framework for sharing data. So I'm going to go back to data for the public good, because that's what it called out for originally, was a common framework for sharing data across infrastructure sectors. But I think it goes a lot broader than that. We don't, it isn't just, infrastructure is a major contributor to climate change, but it doesn't just stop at infrastructure and the built environment, it goes way beyond that. So we need a common framework for sharing data across all sectors, and the information management framework, I think, is being designed to do that. But and the information management framework is the idea of that is setting it's standards, really. It's technical standards. So it's about making sure that all data models for each sector can talk to each other. So it's a common language for sharing data across sectors. But I do think when you are developing standards and common data models, so this sort of relates to what June was talking about in terms of a digital spine. It's all very well each sector, particularly the energy sector, saying we need to share data, we need to make it open within the energy sector. We've got huge problems to solve, but it doesn't just stop at the energy sector or the transport sector or communications. It needs to go across sectors. So the digital spine, or whatever we call it, an information management framework, whatever the common framework is, needs to go across sectors. And I do firmly believe that way you develop a framework, if it is for all sectors, needs to be done in a very open way. It needs to be very inclusive, and it needs to engage with everyone who is going to use it. And that is in itself is a challenge, and the idea of developing a common framework is something that needs to be done over time. But I do think if government doesn't step in and make sure that framework is developed in the right way, there are risks, competition risks, ethical risks about big tech stepping in and providing frameworks which will then be fragmented and not standardized and not accessible. And really, we need to be promoting greater innovation here. What we found was interesting within the Credo project was we didn't just hand the project to one big supplier and say, off you go, this is what we want. We brought together many different experts and innovators in this space, and it is challenging to get people to collaborate. It is challenging, but it's not easy. But I would say the end result is better. It's the diversity argument, isn't it? In terms of developing standards, don't just give it to one set of people. It needs to be inclusive. So I think when we're developing, for me, the national data strategy needs to make sure that we are developing a common framework for sharing data, and that we're developing common resources for improving data quality that people and firms can access, because it's an issue. This point about the quality of information is a problem that private firms, public sector are all experiencing. And there's no point that we all go and reinvent the wheel many times. We need to be sharing common resources.
Thanks, Josh, back to you. You've heard the thoughts of June and Sarah, and I think perhaps just touching on the importance of standards and standardization and your thoughts, and I guess where perhaps you see the kind of greatest benefit or the areas of focus that we should put in developing standards for data sharing.
Yeah, thanks, David. And I think so really good and valuable points there, both from June and Sarah, and you'll have probably noticed that I was scribbling furiously. Yeah, so I mean, I think there's as I would being at a BSI event, I agree that there's a massive potential opportunity for standards, and indeed supporting the development and adoption of standards for sharing of good quality data is one of the priority areas that we identified in the Mission 1 policy framework, which my team published back in the autumn. So we're definitely taken with this, and definitely, obviously we've spoken a little bit about the information management framework, something that's obviously being led out of BAZE Business Department, but that's something that I think has a kind of potential to have real impact in this space. But the other thing that I think is probably kind of worth flagging is the expert panel that we have set up with BSI, actually, to look into kind of where some of the really big opportunities for standards to enable data sharing could be, and indeed, the mention of kind of net zero and climate is a really big part of that. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily kind of leap to one specific answer, but I absolutely agree with the point, particularly the point that Sarah was making around this needing to be, we need to get to an end state where there are different systems that can talk to each other, and we don't end up with siloed either digital twins or data exchange systems which only work for specific sectors or specific applications. There needs to be a way of those communicating with each other and engaging with one another. I think it's a really interesting question is, what is the role of government in enabling that? Is it about government going away and writing the standard ourselves, or effectively, asking an organization like BSI to write those standards? Is it about supporting the ecosystem of standards development and just hoping that, out of some kind of, creative destruction, you will get to a good space and standards? Or is it somewhere in between where we can maybe kind of support and curate and maybe set up kind of, pilots or particular kind of exchange or example projects where they don't necessarily oblige the adoption of standards, but if you can show high quality deliverables and outcomes, that becomes over time a de facto standard. But yeah, it's a really big challenge, and definitely one that's very much on our radar.
Josh, thank you very much. I'll come back to June, if I may, because you mentioned examples, and perhaps I'll ask the other panelists also to give some of their sort of examples. But you said there's some good examples out there. Perhaps you can share some of your thinking around that. And the other question leads into the kind of accuracy and trust. We kind of hear the sort of term greenwashing. People saying they're doing what they're doing, but actually, how do we use data really to demonstrate accurately and in a trusted way that we are doing what we're doing and reducing our CO2 emissions? Or any comments you can make on that?
Great, thank you for the question. Absolutely a fascinating discussion so far. So I think there are so many examples, it's hard to even imagine where to begin, but I think data-driven solutions are transforming the way that we do business as usual across many sectors, and that includes things like the production of food. So precision farming, I think, is one really fascinating example where we can immediately reduce our carbon footprint by doing things like testing at very high resolution what the soil nutrient requirements could be to produce 2,000 calories worth of, say, corn or something. Fertilizing soil is something that is incredibly energy intensive, and nitrogen runoff, I mean, aside from carbon, has all kinds of other harmful environmental side effects. So if we can have some kind of really high resolution idea of what's required in order to grow our food in a way that's more sustainable, that has the potential to revolutionize agriculture, which is really massive, because we need to eat even as the climate becomes warmer. So predicting, weather forecasting at higher resolutions, understanding what the risks are in terms of coming back to the Credo project, things like flooding, and being able to account for things like that in farming scenarios is incredibly important. There's also, if you kind of zoom out a little bit, the ability to use things like AI in discovering new solutions. So I know we're talking about data kind of in direct application to the problem, but if you think about the way we could use AI to actually define and solve a problem, AI is being used in things like materials sciences to develop more sustainable concrete recipes, so to speak. So the way that we're building things is changing because we have this augmented capacity to test solutions before we actually build them, and that's pretty huge. And then in terms of inspiring behavior change using things like data-driven standards, I think about policy as a technology of sorts too. And one example of that is that, in the late 2000s and early 2010s, mobile phone chargers were only compatible with specific mobile phones. And they were, I think, over 30 types on the market. And there was a kind of built-in obsolescence that led to a lot of e-waste. And there was an MOU signed in the EU in which mobile phone manufacturers agreed to harmonize their handsets so that, and we're all using mini USBs afterwards. And while that MOU has since expired, I think we've seen that, we've started to see more standards across the way that we use technology and data-enabled technologies like mobile phones, and that's actually led to the reduction of waste quite significantly. So both in terms of using data-enabled technologies to inspire new solutions, using data to define and describe new hypotheses and generate new hypotheses to be tested, and then also in reducing the footprint of the actual devices that we are using. I think we're seeing a lot of really interesting emerging applications. But again, I think, you know, coming back to what Josh was just saying, standards are going to play a big role in that, especially as we move into this less centralized, you know, energy grid. If we want to maintain a grid frequency of 50 hertz and use electric vehicles as sort of batteries within the system, we really need to be thinking about how to make sure all of these things are interoperable and traceable at the same time.
Thank you, June. Any additional thoughts from you, Sarah? Good examples?
Yeah, before I come to the examples, actually, I'm just going to build upon June's reference to mobile technology, in that I think there's another good parallel so with the evolution of mobile technology back in the 90s, there was competition between GSM technology and CDMA as two different technologies that could be used to call over. So you at the time you couldn't interconnect between CDMA and GSM. It was one or your phone used either the CDMA technology or it used GSM. So GSM was driven by the political will of European governments, because there was a recognition of the need to be able to call, the network effect, to be able to call many people in many areas in many countries. And CDMA was a proprietary technology that was developed privately. And you know, at the end of the day, GSM rather won the race, because it became more prevalent, more widely used, and that's really what you want. And I think this is the same with data sharing, is you want standards that are most widely adopted, that people are using and that most commonly shared and used. That's, you know, but that needs, I think that does need government intervention. It does need some sort of political interference there to make it happen, to make sure that standards are developed for the common good. So I think there is that quite interesting parallel with mobile technology and how you grow out and increase adoption more widely for public good. In terms of examples, I'm going to cheat and I'm going to refer you to the Digital Twin Hub, because there are lots of case studies, and you know, it's always easy to miss out the good ones. So I'm just going to say, go to the DT Hub and have a look. And I think, you know, also I want to go back to Josh's first sort of imagine this, you know, imagine being able to understand, having a digital EPC and being able to understand energy use in your own home. Imagine being able to, you know, when you go and buy something, you understand what the carbon footprint is. As consumers, we have no idea right now. And I think we're very confused about how to contribute, how to be part of that bigger picture. And for me, data, digitalization, digital twins is all about building that bigger picture, understanding how all these different interventions interact and add up to meeting net zero. Because at the moment we're sort of, you know, there's so much information around us that we're just not making use of. And I think it's learning to sort of better measure, monitor, use data more effectively and accurately, so that we have a better understanding of what the impact of our interventions is and how it all adds up.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm probably going to show my age now. I do remember the days when mobile phones used to have dual SIM cards. And if you wanted to go to the US from the UK, you had to take another mobile phone with you because the systems didn't work. Crazy world, and I'm glad that's been solved. Josh, back to you. Good examples of where data is being shared effectively. Do you have any you could add?
I mean, I think my example is probably a little bit more hypothetical, but you know, I think going back to the kind of supply chain question, I think that's a really interesting one. Because you simply don't have, you know, as a consumer, you don't have sight of that, but actually often businesses won't have sight of that as well. So, you know, from a kind of consumer perspective, it's about them having the information to make good decisions, as Sarah was just saying, and use that information and that kind of purchasing power, which is such a kind of big potential driver in this space. But similarly for organizations, if they're looking at their carbon footprint, having a kind of having a standardized way of understanding the carbon impact of their supply chain will help them make decisions about where to make investments and what choices to make. And their starting point might be, well, let's electrify our delivery van fleet or something, because it's very immediate, it's very direct, it's something you can see. And I'm not saying companies shouldn't do that, but there might be actually alternative ways of addressing some of their emissions which aren't visible because of a lack of data and a lack of consistency in the way that data is being presented to them. So yeah, to me, I think that's a really, really interesting example, and again, one where privacy enhancing technologies have the potential to have a really big impact in how that data is shared, because whereas at the moment there is likely to be a lot of nervousness about sharing that kind of information, simply because it's so much of it is commercially sensitive, commercially confidential. If you can strip out the elements of that are commercially sensitive, and just share the elements that are relevant to net zero, I think that's really, really big potential there.
Josh, thank you very much. While I'm sort of directing questions at you, and you may not want to answer this one, there is a question, the usual thorny question around regulation, and will regulation impose a level of complexity? Do you have any views on that to share right now with regards to kind of the regulatory regime and where we might be heading?
I don't think I can. I probably wouldn't want to kind of go into too much detail on that, but I think what I would say is that the starting point, and that has actually the starting point for this government, and definitely the starting point for the reforms that were proposed in the data and new direction consultation, is it's all about simplifying things, making things more straightforward for businesses, for individuals, and I think so the kind of ambition and the aspiration, I think, would definitely be in that direction rather than adding complexity. I think the other thing I would say is, and this is probably a kind of philosophical position of where we are as the current government, etc. But the starting point for kind of any good civil servant as well is you very much start with the interventions that are about nudging people or organisations to do what we believe is the right thing, encouraging uptake, encouraging a shift in the right direction. So the starting point is to kind of regulate or legislate to drive forward any of the things we talked about today. Is not going to be our first port of call.
Josh, thank you very much. Let's just move on to what the panel think are the key challenges. What are the kind of barriers, sort of thoughts on things that we really need to resolve to kind of unlock the value of data, particularly as it relates to reducing CO2 emissions? June, shall I come to you first, and I'll ask the others to comment, but kind of your thoughts on key barriers. What are the kind of one or two key things that have to happen or change, or interventions we need to make to make this more effective?
Certainly. I mean, at the risk of repeating some of what's been said, I think we're up against a lot of technical issues around things like standards. A lot of data isn't available, or at least not available in digital formats. It could be difficult to find or to navigate. It might not be amenable to digital processing. And inevitably, data will be distributed across many organizations and many sectors using different formats, which can change or become outdated over time. I think the transport sector is one case that we've looked at recently where despite a lot of goodwill in the sector, it's just really hard to marry up data when some of it is in a spreadsheet on a laptop and some of it is on paper in a binder in someone's filing cabinet. So I think there's, it shouldn't be underestimated the amount of time and effort that could be required in really bringing some of these systems up to speed. And there are costs associated with that, and we should be realistic about that. But ultimately, we'd like to see data being used in a way that adheres to the FAIR principles, which means it's findable, it's accessible, it's interoperable, and it's reusable. I think, just now and in previous comments from the other panelists, we've highlighted ways in which we're not quite there, but I think we're optimistic. But yeah, there remain those big barriers around the technical aspects. I'd also highlight some of the social barriers around things that have been mentioned, like privacy concerns, especially when working with things like smart meter data, which gives people an idea of what you're doing in your house at a very kind of potentially personal level in terms of how you're using energy, and when you're home and that kind of thing that could be inferred from the way that you're using energy and as that's monitored and reported. So I think there are still some social and technical barriers to be addressed that are quite significant, which I think have come out in some of the other answers as well.
June, thank you very much. I guess one of the big challenges is the sheer pace of change. We need to probably move faster. We don't have a lot of time. And we've mentioned standards and standardization being extremely important. They can often take too long, and we'll need to find more adaptive and agile ways of keeping up with that pace of change in the way we develop standards, obviously supporting future kind of regulatory environments. But Sarah, any thoughts from you on key blockers, key challenges? What do we need to do to get moving?
Yeah, so I agree, agile standards. So as part of a common framework, we lack, in Credo, if we'd had that common framework to share data, it would have been a lot easier to bring it together in the first place. Trusted platforms, how do you bring together different organizations who haven't worked together to share data? How do you persuade them that one platform is better than another? What's the right kind of data sharing agreement that builds trust across organizations who have said, if they haven't worked together before, they haven't got that experience of trusting the people in the other organization. So they're going to put maximum protection in place, which limits what you can do with the data. So having those common resources around trusted platforms, trusted, data sharing agreements. So it's the technical standards, but it's the sort of the softer stuff around it that encourages people to share data in a safe and secure way. We still lack a lot of that sort of soft infrastructure, as it were, that builds the trust that we need. I would also argue for allocated responsibility. So with the regulators, so with the economic regulators, the National Infrastructure Commission made recommendations several years ago that these regulators need climate change, resilience, and collaboration duties, so that they need to start to do that. That would encourage them to think about system resilience and the system meeting net zero rather than the single sector net zero targets or sector resilience, because you really need to see how everything fits together into the integrated system that fits together as that big picture, rather than sort of taking it from a siloed sector point of view. And I think we haven't talked about local authorities much, but I think perhaps looking at the resources for local authorities and duties for local authorities to make better use of data for the public good. And the last point I would make that we haven't talked about is skills. We need to broaden the skill base across the UK. And it isn't just data scientists. If you're building a digital twin, there's a whole range of of skills. We talk about this in the Credo overview report, and we've done work before at the National Digital Twin Programme on the skills that are needed in this area. And it's quite a broad range of skills that are needed, but we need to be investing in there and encouraging young people to, and across all areas, to skill up.
Sarah, thank you. Josh, any final thoughts from you? Key things we need to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with I think everything that June and Sarah have said. I think that the skills point is really important, and more generally the kind of public buy-in question, which has come up a few times today, is really important for this, but also lots of other elements of unlocking the power of data. And I think the other thing I would add, which again echoes something that Sarah mentioned earlier, is how do we expand beyond pockets of good practice, pilot projects, exciting things where there are people who are really, really tech savvy, data savvy, really care about this stuff. That's all well and good, but how do you then translate that into really kind of widespread adoption? Because that's what you need in order to get the level of impact that's necessary here.
Josh, June, Sarah, thank you so much indeed. Fascinating presentations and fascinating discussion. We could go on, I'm sure, for many more hours, but unfortunately we're out of time. But I just wanted to say thank you very much indeed for joining us and sharing your thoughts, and thank you very much indeed for those who have joined us. And sorry we didn't get to your specific question, and we'll try and address those offline if we get the chance. So thank you again, and thank you very much indeed for everybody who's joined us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all, cheers.
Thanks, everybody.